They married her to a peasant for being too fat, but he treated her with real kindness. It was a pronouncement delivered with the cold finality of a death sentence, a public humiliation designed to break what little spirit she had left. Lady Seraphina of Crestwood stood frozen in the glittering ballroom, the music snagging in the air like a torn thread. Every eye, once admiring the chandeliers and the silks, was now fixed upon her. They married her to a peasant for being too fat, but he treated her with real kindness. The words, spoken by her own father, the Earl, echoed in the sudden, suffocating silence. His face was a mask of thunderous rage, his fury not at her, but at the failure of his ambitions. She, with her full figure and quiet disposition, had failed to secure the lustrous match he'd orchestrated with the Viscount Ashworth, a man whose gaze had slid over her with the oily disinterest of a merchant inspecting flawed goods. Seraphina felt the heat climb her neck, a flush of shame so profound it was a physical pain. She was 20 years old, a woman grown, yet she felt like a child being publicly whipped. Her gown, a deep sapphire silk that had taken the seamstress weeks to perfect, suddenly felt like a cage, its boning digging into her ribs, mocking her form. She saw the whispers begin, the flutter of fans hiding cruel smiles, the pitying glances that were somehow worse than the scorn. Her father's voice cut through the murmurs again, each word a hammer blow. She has proven herself unfit for the station to which she was born, the Earl declared, his voice ringing with self-righteous fury. Her appetites are clearly more suited to a simpler life. Therefore, a simpler life she shall have. I have arranged a match. She will be wed to a tenant farmer from the Blackwood estate, a man of the soil. Perhaps in learning to till the earth, she will learn some measure of humility and discipline. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. To marry a daughter of an earl to a commoner, a man with dirt beneath his nails and no name to speak of, was not just a punishment. It was a social erasure. It was a declaration that she was no longer one of them. She was being cast out. Seraphina's gaze darted to her mother, who stood pale and silent, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white, offering no defense. She looked to her younger sister Elara, whose perfect, doll-like face was a mask of horrified fascination. There was no help, no rescue. The next 48 hours passed in a blur of cold dread. She was stripped of her fine clothes, her jewels locked away. She was dressed in a simple frock of brown wool, coarse and unfamiliar against her skin. The wedding, if it could be called that, took place in the dusty, disused chapel at the edge of the estate. The only witnesses were her stony-faced father and a grim-faced solicitor. Her groom was waiting. He was tall, broader in the shoulder than any courtier, with a stillness about him that was unnerving. His hair was the color of dark earth, unkempt and falling across a brow that was set in a permanent glower. His face was all harsh angles and shadow, his jaw tight, his mouth a grim, unsmiling line. A faint, silvery scar cut through his left eyebrow, giving him a dangerous, almost feral look. He wore simple, homespun clothes, clean but worn, and his hands were large, calloused, the hands of a man who worked for his bread. He did not look at her, not once. The priest, smelling faintly of sour wine, mumbled the rites with hurried indifference. When it came time for her to speak her vows, the words caught in her throat, a knot of unshed tears. She forced them out, a whisper in the cavernous silence. Her husband's voice, when he finally spoke, was a low, rough baritone, as gravelly as a riverbed. He said the words and nothing more. No name was given. He was simply the groom. A ring, a simple, unadorned band of iron, was pushed onto her finger. It felt cold and heavy, a manacle. And then it was over. She was no longer Lady Seraphina. She was a peasant's wife. He led her from the chapel without a word, his grip on her arm firm but not cruel. An old, flatbed cart waited outside, a tired-looking nag already harnessed. He helped her up onto the rough wooden seat, his touch impersonal, efficient. The silence stretched between them, a chasm of unspoken misery and resentment. He climbed up beside her, took the reins, and with a soft click of his tongue, set the horse into a slow, plodding walk. She did not look back at the grand stone facade of Crestwood Manor, the only home she had ever known. She stared straight ahead, her back ramrod straight, focusing on the rhythmic clop of the horse's hooves on the dirt road, the only sound in a world that had suddenly gone quiet. The journey lasted for hours. They left the manicured lands of her father's estate, passing through rolling fields that gave way to denser, wilder country. The sun began to dip low, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and orange. The air grew cooler, smelling of damp earth and pine. The road narrowed into a track, flanked on one side by a steep, wooded hill and on the other by a vast, dark forest that seemed to swallow the light. Blackwood, her father had said. This was the Duke of Blackwood's land, a vast, untamed territory ruled by a reclusive, half-mad nobleman no one ever saw. Fear, a cold and unfamiliar companion, settled deep in her belly. What kind of man lived out here? What kind of life awaited her at the end of this silent, dreadful journey? Finally, as twilight bled into true dark, he pulled the cart to a halt. Before them, nestled in a small clearing, was a cottage. It was small, built of stone and timber, with a thatched roof from which a thin curl of smoke rose into the evening air. A small, well-tended garden sat to one side, its rows of vegetables neat and orderly. It was the humblest dwelling she had ever seen. This was it. This was her prison. This was her home. Her husband jumped down from the cart, his movements fluid and sure in the dim light. He came around to her side and looked up, his face still shadowed and unreadable. He held up his hands to help her down. For a moment, she hesitated, her heart hammering against her ribs. Then, taking a breath that felt like a surrender, she placed her hands in his and allowed him to lift her down to the ground, to the start of her new life. He led her to the door and pushed it open, stepping aside to let her enter. The air inside was warm and smelled of wood smoke and dried herbs. A fire was already crackling in the stone hearth, its flickering light casting dancing shadows across the single, large room. It was sparse, but it was shockingly, meticulously clean. The wooden floor was swept. A simple table and 2 chairs stood polished in the center, and a stack of neatly chopped firewood was piled by the hearth. There was a sense of order, of quiet dignity, that was utterly at odds with the brutish man she had imagined. Her husband followed her in, closing the door behind them and plunging the room into the warm intimacy of the firelight. He moved past her to a small door at the back of the room. "This is your room," he said. His voice, the first words he had spoken directly to her since their vows, was still that low, rough baritone, but it was quieter now, less harsh. She pushed open the door he had indicated. It led to a tiny chamber, barely large enough for the narrow bed within. But the bed was made with clean, patched linens, and a thick woolen blanket was folded at its foot. A single, small window looked out into the impenetrable darkness of the woods. It was a cell, but it was a clean one. When she returned to the main room, he was standing by the fire, his back to her. "There is stew on the hearth. And bread." He gestured to the table where a small, dark loaf and 2 bowls sat waiting. He served the stew, a thick, savory concoction of vegetables and some kind of meat, ladling it into the bowls without another word. They ate in silence. Serafina, who had been starved of everything but her own humiliation for 2 days, found the simple meal was the most delicious thing she had ever tasted. It was nourishing, real. She did not know what she expected. She expected him to be cruel, to gloat over her downfall. She expected him to be brutish, to take what he likely considered his due. When the meal was finished, he simply took their empty bowls, rinsed them in a basin of water, and then unrolled a simple straw pallet and a rough blanket by the dying embers of the fire. He lay down without a word, turning his back to her, and was still. Serafina stood frozen for a long moment, confusion warring with her fear. He was leaving her the only bed. He was not going to touch her. He was offering her a sliver of privacy, of dignity, she had not been granted by anyone in her own family. She retreated to the small bedroom, closing the door softly behind her. She lay down on the narrow cot, still in her coarse wool dress, and listened to the sounds of the cottage. The crackle of the dying fire, the sigh of the wind in the trees, and the slow, steady breathing of the silent, enigmatic man in the other room. For the first time in days, a single hot tear escaped her and traced a path down her temple. It was not a tear of sorrow or of shame. It was a tear of sheer, bewildering confusion. The first week was a silent ballet of awkward coexistence. He rose before the sun, his movements quiet as he rebuilt the fire and left the cottage. He would return hours later with game or fish or wood, depositing them by the door before disappearing again to work in the fields she could just glimpse through the trees. He left her to her own devices, a prisoner in a cage with an unlocked door. She did not know how to cook, how to clean, how to mend in any practical sense. Her life had been one of ornamental uselessness. The first loaf of bread she tried to bake was a charred, inedible rock. Her attempts at washing his rough shirts in the nearby stream left her hands raw and the shirts no cleaner. She felt her incompetence as a fresh wave of humiliation. One afternoon, he returned to find her weeping in frustration over a tangled mess of thread as she tried to patch a hole in her dress. He stopped in the doorway, watching her for a long moment. She braced herself for a sneer, for a cruel remark about the uselessness of a fine lady. Instead, he walked over, took the garment from her trembling hands, and examined the tear. "The thread is too thick for the cloth," he said, his voice neutral. He went to a small wooden chest in the corner, a place she had not dared to look, and took out a small spool of finer thread and a sharper needle. He handed them to her. "Try this." She looked up at him, her tear-streaked face full of astonishment. "Thank you," she whispered. He gave a curt nod and turned away, but not before she saw something flicker in his eyes. It was not pity. It was something else, something quieter. From that day, a subtle shift occurred. He began to instruct her. Not with words, not at first, but by example. He would show her how to properly knead dough, his large, calloused hands moving with surprising dexterity. He showed her which herbs from the garden to use in the stew, how to bank the fire so it would burn through the night. He took her into the woods and showed her how to find dry kindling, how to distinguish edible mushrooms from poisonous ones. His teaching was practical, direct, and devoid of judgment. He never once mentioned her previous life or her current clumsiness. He simply showed her what needed to be done. Serafina, in turn, began to learn. Her hands, once soft and pale, became chapped and then calloused. Her back ached from bending over the garden, her arms from carrying water from the well. But with the aches came a new feeling, competence. She learned to bake a decent loaf of bread. She learned to keep the cottage clean and warm. She found a quiet satisfaction in the rhythm of the work, in the tangible results of her labor. She was contributing. She was useful. One evening, as a cold autumn rain lashed against the windows, she was tidying the main room. His palette was rolled neatly in the corner, and as she moved it to sweep beneath, her fingers brushed against a loose floorboard. Curiosity, a feeling she hadn't had room for amidst her misery, pricked at her. Glancing at the door, she knelt and carefully pried the board up. Beneath it, nestled in the dark space, was a small, leather-bound book. It was not the rough, practical sort of ledger a farmer might keep. The leather was fine, worn smooth with use, the kind of object that spoke of wealth and leisure. Her heart hammered. She lifted it out. It fell open to a bookmarked page, and she saw not figures or lists, but verse. It was poetry, and handwritten in the margins were notes, critiques and observations written in a fluid, elegant script. The handwriting of a scholar, a nobleman. It was a stark, impossible contradiction to the illiterate peasant she had married. The cottage door creaked open, and he stood there, dripping with rain, his hair plastered to his forehead. He froze, his gaze locking on the book in her hands. A storm of emotions crossed his face. Shock, anger, and something that looked terrifyingly like fear. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. I found it, she stammered, holding it out as if it were a weapon. Under the floor. The poetry, the writing. He strode across the room in 2 long steps and snatched the book from her hand, his fingers brushing hers. The brief touch sent a jolt through her. He shoved the book into the wooden chest and slammed the lid. It belonged to the man who lived here before, he said, his voice flat and hard. He would not meet her eyes. It's nothing. Forget you saw it. But Serafina could not forget. The lie was too clumsy, too obvious. The look in his eyes had been one of a man caught in a profound deception. He was not who he said he was. The mystery of him, which had been a quiet, background hum, now became a roaring question in her mind. Who was this man who slept by the fire and read poetry in secret? Who was this peasant with the eyes of a haunted lord? The rain beat against the roof, mirroring the turmoil that had suddenly awoken in her heart. He was a lie, but the kindness, the quiet, steady kindness he had shown her, that felt devastatingly real. The discovery of the book created a new, unspoken tension between them. He became more withdrawn, his silences deeper, more watchful. Serafina, for her part, found herself observing him with a new intensity, searching for cracks in the facade of the simple farmer. She noticed the way he stood, not with the stoop of a laborer, but with the straight-backed posture of a soldier. She noticed the precision in his movements, whether he was gutting a fish or sharpening an axe. There was an economy of motion that spoke of training, of discipline. And his speech, though rare, was not that of a commoner. He used no slang, his grammar was perfect, his words chosen with care. He was a man playing a part, and the longer she watched, the more the costume seemed to fray at the edges. Yet, his behavior towards her remained unchanged. He was still patient, still respectful of her space. The gentle rhythm of their shared life continued, and against her will, Serafina found the sharp edges of her suspicion beginning to soften. The lie was a stone in her shoe, a constant irritant, but the reality of her daily life was one of growing peace. She was no longer Lady Serafina, scorned and useless. She was just Serafina, a woman who could bake bread that rose, who could tend a wound, who could find a strange solace in the quiet green of the forest. One frosty morning, she woke to the sound of a pained groan from the main room. Alarmed, she hurried from her bed. He, the man she had mentally started calling Alaric, after overhearing a villager use the name, was sitting up on his pallet, his face pale and beaded with sweat. His hand was pressed against his side. "What is it?" she asked, her voice tight with concern. "It's nothing," he gritted out, but even as he spoke, he flinched, a sharp intake of breath betraying his pain. "An old wound." "Let me see," she insisted, her nascent skill with herbs overriding her hesitation. He resisted at first, but another wave of pain seemed to break his resolve. He reluctantly shifted, pulling aside his rough tunic. A thick, jagged scar, long-healed but brutally ugly, ran across his ribs. It was the type of wound made by a sword or a pike. A soldier's wound. At one end, the scar was red and inflamed, a knot of angry flesh. "It pains you when the cold sets in deep," she stated, her voice soft. She had read about such things in an old herbalist's text in her father's library. He looked at her, surprised. I have something for it." She went to the collection of dried herbs she had painstakingly gathered and hung from the rafters. She selected chamomile for the swelling and yarrow to draw out the heat, crushing them with a bit of lard to make a poultice. Her hands worked with a confidence that surprised even her. He watched her, his expression unreadable. When she finished, she knelt beside him. "This may be cold," she warned. She gently applied the poultice to the inflamed scar. His skin was hot to the touch. He hissed as the cool salve made contact, his muscles tensing under her hand. She worked carefully, her touch light but firm, spreading the mixture over the angry flesh. For a long moment, they were frozen in a tableau of startling intimacy. Her, the disgraced lady, tending to the scarred body of her peasant husband, whose secret identity was a silent scream in the small room. His breathing was ragged, but she did not think it was entirely from the pain. "How do you know to do this?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. "I read. In my father's house, I was not permitted to do much else," she said, a hint of the old bitterness creeping into her voice. "The books were my only company." He was silent for a long time. "They were fools to waste you," he said finally, so quietly she almost didn't hear it. The words struck her with the force of a physical blow. No one had ever said anything like that to her. No one had ever seen her as anything but a failure, a disappointment, an object to be married off. He saw her as wasted, as something of value that had been overlooked. She finished her work, her hands trembling slightly, and bandaged the wound with a strip of clean linen. The air between them was thick with things unsaid, with a connection that was growing deeper and more dangerous with every shared silence, every quiet act of care. As the days turned into weeks, the cottage became less of a prison and more of a sanctuary. The lie he was living remained a chasm between them, yet paradoxically, it was in this false world that Serafina felt seen for the first time. Alaric, for she refused to think of him as anything else, began to talk more. He never spoke of his past, of where he came from or who his family was. But he spoke of other things. He told her the names of the constellations that glittered in the cold, clear nights. He taught her to read the forest, to know by the snap of a twig whether it was a deer or a fox passing by. In return, she began to speak of her own life. Not the grand balls or the empty titles, but the small, hidden corners of her existence. She told him about the secret alcove in the library where she used to hide and read for hours. She described the kindness of a particular kitchen maid who would sneak her warm tarts. She spoke of the crushing loneliness of a life spent being constantly measured and found wanting. He listened to it all, his intense gaze never leaving her face, his silence a vessel that could hold all her unspoken pain. One afternoon, he came back from the woods not with a rabbit or firewood, but with a small, intricately carved wooden bird, its wings half spread as if in mid-flight. He held it out to her, his expression hesitant. "I made this for you," he said, the words clumsy, as if he were unused to them. She took the bird, its surface sanded smooth as silk. The craftsmanship was exquisite, detailed, and delicate. It was the work of an artist, not a rough farmer. It was another piece of him that did not fit the puzzle. "It's beautiful," she breathed, her heart aching with a strange, sweet pain. "No one has ever made anything for me before." She placed the bird on the mantelpiece, where it seemed to watch over their small, quiet world. The little carving was a turning point. It was a gift given not out of duty, but out of something else. Something he was fighting, and something she was terrified to name. His internal conflict was becoming more palpable. She would catch him watching her when she was reading by the fire, his face a mask of such profound turmoil and longing that it made her breath catch. He was trapped in his own deception, and she was trapped with him, her feelings for this enigmatic, kind man growing into a love that felt both impossible and inevitable. The need for supplies eventually became unavoidable. Their stores of flour and salt were low, and the autumn harvest had not yielded enough to see them through the entire winter. "We must go to the village," Alaric announced one morning, his tone grim. A cold dread washed over Serafina. The village, people, eyes. The thought of being seen, of being recognized as the disgraced earl's daughter now living as a commoner, was terrifying. I cannot," she whispered. "You will not be alone," he said, his voice firm. "I will be with you." There was a promise in his words, a shield in his presence that she found herself, reluctantly, trusting. She wrapped a drab woolen shawl over her head, hiding her face as best she could, and they set out on the path that led away from their isolated clearing. The walk was tense. Serafina kept her eyes fixed on the ground, her heart pounding with every step that brought them closer to civilization. The village of Blackwood Crossing was larger than she expected, a bustling little community nestled by a river. As they entered the small market square, Serafina braced for stares and whispers, but no one paid her any mind. Their attention was all for Alaric. "Alaric, good morning to you," called the blacksmith, a mountain of a man with soot on his face. "That plowshare you designed is a marvel. Holds its edge like nothing I've ever forged." Alaric gave a nod. "The temper is the key, Magnus. Quench it in brine." An elderly woman rushed from the bakery, wiping her floury hands on her apron. "Alaric, my boy, your poultice worked wonders on Thomas's chest. He's breathing easy for the first time in a week. You must take an extra loaf, no arguments." She pressed a warm, fragrant loaf of bread into his hands, her eyes full of genuine gratitude. Serafina watched, stunned into silence. This was not the deference paid to a nobleman's name. This was respect, earned respect. They saw him not as a tenant farmer, a mere laborer, but as a leader, a wise man, a healer. He moved through the village with a quiet authority that had nothing to do with land or title. He was a man of substance in his own right. The mystery of him deepened, but so did her admiration. He was more than the part he was playing, and he was more than the title he was hiding. He was simply Alaric, and the woman who walked beside him felt a swell of pride that was as foreign as it was overwhelming. Their business concluded, they began the walk home. The sky, clear that morning, had turned a bruised, ominous gray. The wind picked up, whipping Serafina's shawl about her face. Before they were halfway back to the cottage, the heavens opened. A cold, driving rain began to fall, turning the path to mud in minutes. They were soaked through in moments, the icy water plastering their clothes to their skin. "This way!" Alaric shouted over the roar of the wind, grabbing her hand. His grip was strong and warm. He pulled her off the path, through a thicket of trees, towards an old, dilapidated barn she hadn't noticed before. They stumbled inside, the sudden shelter from the wind and rain a shocking relief. The barn was dark and smelled of hay and damp earth. Rain hammered on the roof like a drum. They stood shivering in the gloom, water dripping from their hair and clothes, creating puddles at their feet. The proximity, the shared vulnerability of their situation was electric. He was so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. "You're freezing," he said, his voice husky. Before she could protest, he was shrugging off his heavy, soaked wool cloak. He wrapped it around her shoulders. It was heavy and smelled of him, of rain and earth and wood smoke. Felt like an embrace. His hands lingered on her shoulders for a fraction of a second too long, his thumbs stroking the wool just above her collarbones. She looked up at him. In the dim light filtering through the cracks in the barn walls, his face was all shadow and intensity. The glower was gone. In its place was an expression of such raw, unguarded tenderness it stole the air from her lungs. The distance between them had vanished. There was no earl's daughter, no peasant farmer. There were only two people, a man and a woman, taking shelter from a storm. She could see the pulse beating in his throat, feel the tremor in the hands that still rested on her shoulders. The world seemed to shrink to the space of that dusty, forgotten barn, to the sound of the rain and their own ragged breathing. Back at the cottage, the storm outside continued to rage, but a different kind of storm was brewing within its warm, dry walls. They moved in a haze of unspoken tension, shedding their wet outer layers and huddling close to the roaring fire he built. He handed her a mug of hot, mulled cider, his fingers brushing against hers, sending a fresh jolt through her already frayed nerves. The simple domesticity of the moment felt charged with a significance that was almost unbearable. They sat in silence for a long time, the only sounds the crackling of the logs and the drumming of the rain. The barrier of his deception, of her shame, had been worn thin by weeks of shared work, quiet care, and the startling intimacy of the barn. It was he who finally broke the silence. "Serafina," he said, her name a soft murmur in the firelit room. She looked at him, her heart thudding a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. He was not looking at the fire anymore. He was looking at her, and the carefully constructed mask of the stoic farmer had fallen away completely. His eyes, the color of a stormy sea, were filled with a maelstrom of regret and a deep, aching longing. I never intended for this," he began, his voice rough with emotion. He faltered, searching for words. He did not confess the truth of his identity, the great, towering lie that stood between them. Instead, he confessed a smaller, more devastating truth. "I have lived my life in walls of my own making. I believed all people were driven by avarice and ambition. I believed there was no truth to be found in the world. I was wrong." He reached out, his calloused hand gently cupping her jaw. His touch was hesitant, reverent. "You have more strength in your spirit than any army. You have more grace in your heart than any bejeweled courtier. They tried to bury you, and you bloomed in the dark." Tears welled in her eyes, hot and sudden. His words were a balm on wounds she hadn't even known were still bleeding. He saw her, not the Earl's fat daughter, not the disgraced bride, but her, the person she was underneath it all. This was the highest, most exquisite peak of dramatic irony. She believed she was being seen and loved for herself by a humble, honest man of the soil, a man who had nothing to offer but his heart. She did not know that this validation was coming from one of the most powerful men in the kingdom, a duke who had set out to test her worth and had, in the process, discovered his own. He leaned in, his gaze searching hers, asking a silent question. She gave a barely perceptible nod, a surrender to the inevitable, powerful current that had been pulling them together since that first silent journey. He kissed her. It was not a kiss of raw passion or demanding ownership. It was a kiss of profound, aching tenderness. It was gentle, searching, a confession of everything he could not say. It spoke of regret for the lie and reverence for the truth he had found in her. It was a promise, a beautiful, fragile promise that he knew, even as he made it, was built on a foundation of sand. In that moment, Serafina let go. She let go of the shame, the fear, the loneliness. She let go of the past that had defined her and embraced the present that was healing her. She returned his kiss with all the pent-up yearning of a lifetime, her arms winding around his neck, pulling him closer. She believed she had found a true and honest love in the humblest of places, a love that saw her, a love that cherished her. She gave him her trust, her heart, her very soul, unaware that the world she had just found was about to be irrevocably shattered. Their fragile, perfect bubble of happiness was a beautiful, shimmering thing. It was also doomed. The breaking point came on a crisp, sunlit afternoon 2 weeks later. It arrived in a cloud of dust and the jingle of expensive harnesses, a sound utterly alien to their quiet clearing. A gleaming black carriage, its panels emblazoned with a familiar crest, had become mired in the mud of the forest track not 100 yards from the cottage. The horses stamped and snorted, and an imperious, feminine voice could be heard berating the driver. Alaric stiffened, a look of profound dread dawning on his face. "Stay inside," he commanded, his voice tight, but it was too late. The carriage door was thrown open and a figure, exquisitely dressed in emerald green traveling silks, stepped out with impatient grace. It was Alara. Her beautiful, heart-shaped face was a mask of aristocratic annoyance as she surveyed the mud sullying her velvet shoes. Her gaze swept the clearing and fell upon the cottage. Then her eyes landed on Serafina, who stood frozen in the doorway, a half-woven basket forgotten in her hands. Alara's mouth fell open. "Serafina? My God, is that you? You look rustic." Her eyes raked over Serafina's simple homespun dress and work-roughened hands with undisguised disdain. Then, Alara's gaze shifted to the man who had emerged from the cottage to stand beside Serafina. Alaric stood tall, his body a protective shield in front of her. Alara's eyes widened, her expression shifting from contempt to utter, stupefied shock. The color drained from her face. She took a hesitant step forward, her scorn forgotten, replaced by a dawning, horrified recognition. She dropped into a clumsy, panicked curtsy, her silk skirts brushing the damp earth. "Your Grace," Alara whispered, her voice trembling. She stared at Alaric, her eyes wide with disbelief. Duke of Blackwood? What in God's name are you doing in this hovel? With her. The world tilted on its axis. Duke of Blackwood. The words slammed into Seraphina with the force of a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. The reclusive, half-mad duke whose lands these were. The most powerful, most enigmatic, most sought-after bachelor in the kingdom. This man, her husband, Alaric. It all crashed down on her in a single, horrifying wave of understanding. The lie, the test, the poetry book, the scar, his quiet authority, his perfect speech. It wasn't a peasant who had seen her worth. It was a duke playing a cruel game. Her father hadn't married her to a farmer to punish her. He had married her to a duke to test her. It was all a performance. Their life together, the shared work, the quiet conversations, the growing tenderness, the kiss. It was all part of the elaborate, humiliating charade. She felt the blood drain from her face, the warmth of the sun, the chirping of the birds, the solid ground beneath her feet. It all receded into a distant, cold hum. She looked at him, at the man she had given her heart to, and saw not Alaric, the kind, steady man of the woods, but a stranger, a powerful, deceitful nobleman who had orchestrated her ultimate humiliation. "No," she whispered, the word a raw, broken thing. She took a step back, away from him, as if his very presence could burn her. The beautiful wooden bird on the mantelpiece seemed to mock her. The entire cottage, once her sanctuary, was now a stage, the setting for her greatest folly. "Seraphina, please," he began, taking a step toward her, his hand outstretched, his face a canvas of anguish and desperation. "Let me explain." "Explain." Her voice was hollow, dead. "Explain the test? Was I humble enough for you, your grace? Did the fat, disgraced daughter of the Earl pass your little character examination? Did I grovel sufficiently? Did I prove myself worthy of the great Duke of Blackwood by learning to scrub floors and bake bread?" Each word was a shard of glass. She saw the pain flinch across his face, but she felt no pity, only a vast arctic emptiness where her heart had been. She turned her back on him, on the life she had thought was real, and faced her stunned sister. Alara was staring, wide-eyed, from the powerful duke to her disheveled sister, the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place in her mind. "Take me with you," Seraphina said, her voice devoid of all emotion. "Take me away from here. Now." "Seraphina, don't do this," Alaric pleaded, his voice cracking. "What we have, it is real. My feelings for you are real." She laughed, a short, bitter sound that held no mirth. "Feelings? Your Grace has confused feelings with the satisfactory results of an experiment. There is nothing real here. There never was." She refused to look at him again. To look at him would be to break, and she would not give him the satisfaction. She walked, straight-backed and proud, toward her sister's carriage, not as a lady, not as a peasant, but as a woman who had been shattered and was now gathering the pieces. She climbed into the opulent carriage without a backward glance, leaving the man she loved and the life she had cherished behind in the mocking sunshine. The cottage, her haven, was now nothing more than the scene of a devastating betrayal. The journey with Alara was a silent, tense affair. Seraphina answered no questions, offered no explanations. She stared out the window, her expression a frozen mask, as the familiar woods of Blackwood gave way to the open road. She did not return to her father's estate. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her broken, or the opportunity to gloat over the success of his cruel scheme. When they reached the crossroads, she gave the driver a new destination. "Take me to the convent of St. Jude the Obscure," she commanded, her voice firm. It was a small, forgotten priory in the remote northern hills, endowed by her great-aunt generations ago. It was a place for forgotten women, a place to disappear. Alara protested, but Seraphina was immovable. She was deposited at the convent's cold stone gates like a parcel, and she walked inside without looking back, seeking the oblivion of routine and prayer. She traded her homespun dress for a simple novice's habit, her name for the anonymity of a sister. She threw herself into the hard, physical labor of the convent, tending the gardens, scrubbing stone floors, caring for the sick. The work was punishing, but it was honest. It was real, and in the exhaustion of her body, she found a temporary respite from the agony of her heart. But at night, in the silence of her small, cold cell, the memories would return. Alaric's quiet voice, the feel of his hand on her jaw, the devastating tenderness of his kiss, and the betrayal would slice through her anew, sharp and merciless. She had not been loved. She had been judged and approved. The kindness had been a lie. It was all a lie. Meanwhile, Alaric, the Duke of Blackwood, was left alone in the devastating silence of the cottage. The fire went out. The air grew cold. The space that had been filled with her quiet presence now echoed with her absence. He saw her everywhere, in the neatly folded linens, in the half-finished mending basket, in the book of herbs she had left open on the table. The small wooden bird on the mantel seemed to accuse him with its silent, unblinking stare. He had won his wager with the Earl. He had found a woman of character, a wife who valued substance over station. But in his arrogant, cynical quest, he had destroyed the very thing he had sought. He had found a true heart, only to break it with his own deception. The isolation he had once cultivated as a shield now felt like the prison he deserved. He was the Duke of Blackwood, a man of immense power and wealth, and he had never felt more impoverished. He had tested for a diamond and, upon finding it, had crushed it under his heel. He loved her. It was a truth that burned in his soul with the agony of a fresh wound. And he knew, with chilling certainty, that he had lost her forever. The test had been a fool's errand, and he, the brilliant, reclusive Duke, had been the biggest fool of all. Weeks bled into a month, then 2. At the convent, Seraphina found a fragile peace. The rigid structure of the days and the quiet companionship of the other sisters began to form a scar over her wound. She discovered a talent for healing, her knowledge of herbs proving invaluable in the infirmary. The abbess, a wise, discerning woman, saw both the pain and the strength in the new novice and gave her responsibility, and with it, a renewed sense of purpose. She was no longer waiting for her life to be determined by others. She was building one of her own, stone by quiet stone. She told herself she was content. She told herself she had forgotten him. It was a lie she repeated every day, a prayer against the hollowing ache of his memory. Alaric did not remain in the cottage. The place was a monument to his failure, and he could not bear it. He returned to Blackwood Manor, his vast, empty castle, and was consumed by a grief so profound it bordered on madness. He saw her face in every shadow, heard her voice in the wind rattling the casements. For weeks he did nothing. He drank. He stared into the fire. He was the reclusive, haunted Duke his reputation claimed him to be. But the memory of her, not the broken woman who left, but the resilient woman who had bloomed in the dark, would not let him be. Her quiet strength, her unexpected laughter, her unwavering kindness. He had set out to find a woman immune to the corrupting influence of his title, and he had succeeded. But he had failed to consider the corrupting influence of his own deception. Words were not enough to fix what he had broken. An apology would be an insult. He had to prove he had changed. He had to become a man worthy of the love he had so carelessly destroyed. And so, the Duke of Blackwood began to act. News travels slowly to a remote convent, but it arrives nonetheless. Whispers came first, carried by merchants and travelers seeking shelter. The reclusive Duke of Blackwood had appeared at the royal court. He had caused a scandal. Seraphina tried to ignore it, to close her heart to any news of him. But then, a letter arrived not from him, but from the abbess's cousin, a lady-in-waiting to the queen. The abbess, her brow furrowed, read it aloud to Seraphina in the privacy of her study. The Duke of Blackwood, the letter said, had requested an audience with the king and the entire assembled court. He had stood before the glittering assembly, the very people whose judgment Seraphina had fled, and he had delivered a speech that had stunned the kingdom into silence. He had spoken not of politics or war, but of value, of worth. He spoke of a society that prized polished surfaces over inner substance, that confused beauty with virtue and wealth with character. He publicly, mercilessly, shamed the Earl of Crestwood for the callous treatment of his own daughter, laying bare the cruelty that passed for aristocratic ambition. Then he had turned the judgment upon himself, confessing his own cynicism, his own arrogance in believing he could test a human heart as if it were a piece of metal. And then came the grand gesture. He announced the establishment of the Serafina Fund, an enormous endowment, funded from his personal fortune. It was not for the daughters of dukes and earls. It was a dowry fund for women of intelligence, character, and skill, regardless of their birth, their connections, or their appearance. It was a revolution, a direct assault on the marriage market that had so casually discarded her. Finally, he had looked directly at the king and declared that he had found more truth, more honor, and more nobility in a small cottage with a woman the world had deemed worthless than in all the palaces of the realm. He had not begged for her, or demanded her return. He had simply honored her publicly and unequivocally, and in doing so had proven that his values had been irrevocably changed. He had used his great power not to possess her, but to validate her. Serafina sat in stunned silence, the abbess's voice fading into the background. This was not the act of a man trying to win back a prize. This was an act of profound penance, an act of transformation. He wasn't just trying to fix his mistake. He was trying to remake the world that had hurt her. A week later, a lone rider appeared at the convent gates. He did not announce himself as a duke. He wore the simple, dark clothes of a traveler. It was Alaric. He did not demand entry. He did not send messages. He simply dismounted, tethered his horse, and waited. He stood at the gates from sunup to sundown, day after day, in silent, humble vigil. The sisters whispered amongst themselves. He was a specter of patience, a man waiting for a judgment he knew he deserved. For 3 days, Serafina refused to see him. She tended her garden, her hands trembling, her heart a war within her. The man at the gate was not the arrogant duke who had deceived her. He was the man who had stood in the rain, waiting for a verdict. He was Alaric. On the 4th day, she could bear it no longer. She walked out to the gate. He looked thinner. The haunted look was still in his eyes, but it was tempered now with a quiet resolve. He did not rush toward her, did not bombard her with excuses. He simply looked at her, his heart in his eyes. "Serafina," he said, his voice hoarse. "Your Grace," she replied, her tone cool, but her resolve was wavering. "The Duke of Blackwood was a fool," he said, his voice raw with sincerity. He was a cynical, arrogant man who built walls to protect a heart he didn't think was worth protecting. He devised a test and failed it himself, because he did not understand that trust, once broken, cannot be easily mended. "He is a man I no longer wish to be." He took a hesitant step closer. "But Alaric, the man who tended a garden with you, the man who learned from you that kindness is a strength, not a weakness, the man you taught to see the stars again, he loves you. I love you, not for passing a test, not because you are worthy of my title. I love you for the woman you are, for your quiet courage, your fierce heart, your gentle hands. It was real, Serafina. My love for you was the only real thing in the entire deception." He stopped before her, laying his soul bare. "I cannot erase the lie, but I will spend the rest of my life building a truth with you, if you will let me. I am not asking you to forgive the Duke. I am asking if you can find it in your heart to love Alaric." Tears streamed down her face, washing away the last of the ice around her heart. It was the apology she had needed to hear, an admission not just of his fault, but of his own brokenness. He was not a god handing down judgment, but a man, flawed and penitent, asking for grace. I never stopped loving Alaric," she whispered, the confession a painful, liberating truth. "I just didn't know if he was real." "I am real," he said, his own eyes shining with unshed tears. "And I am yours, if you will have me." She nodded, a sob escaping her. He closed the distance between them and gathered her into his arms. His embrace was not one of possession, but of homecoming. It was an embrace of two broken people finding their way back to whole. They were married again, not in a dusty, forgotten chapel, but in the convent's simple garden, with the abbess and the sisters as their witnesses. She did not wear silk or jewels, but a simple white dress, a crown of wildflowers from her own garden in her hair. He was not announced as the Duke of Blackwood, but simply as Alaric. They made their vows not as a nobleman and his lady, but as a man and a woman, equals in heart and purpose. They did not return to the grandeur of Blackwood Manor. Instead, they returned to the cottage. It had been cleaned and aired, a fire laid in the hearth. It was no longer a stage for a deception, but a foundation on which to build a true life. Over the next year, the cottage was subtly expanded. A new wing added for a proper library, the garden enlarged. But it remained, at its heart, the small stone cottage where they had found each other. Alaric did not abdicate his title, but he wielded it differently. Guided by Seraphina's quiet wisdom and compassion, he used his power to enact real change, championing the forgotten and the overlooked. The Seraphina Fund flourished, changing the lives of countless women, its legacy a testament to a love that had reshaped a corner of their world. But his life, his true life, was here in the woods with her. He was no longer the reclusive, haunted duke, and she was no longer the scorned, invisible lady. She was his partner, his counsel, his heart. Her worth, once questioned by an entire society, was now the undeniable center of his universe. One late summer evening, they stood in their garden as the sun set, painting the sky in fiery strokes. He came to stand behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder. Her hands, no longer soft but strong and capable, came up to rest on his. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the day end, their shared life stretching before them. A future built not on lies or titles, but on the enduring, hard-won truth of their connection. In the quiet of the forest, surrounded by the life they had nurtured together, they had found their own small, triumphant kingdom.